All right, let's get started. Next week, we're moving on from Baudelaire, and we're getting into Baudelaire's 20th century followers, namely the Surrealists. So, as with other segments of the course, we're going to be dealing with some of the primary text material, not just Benjamin's writings. So we're going to start with Breton, André Breton, the Pope of Surrealism, his book Mad Love. And we've looked at the mimetic faculty again, but maybe refresh yourselves on that. And we looked at Baudelaire's Wreck, Vickers, Wine, Beauty, and To a Passerby, but also refresh yourselves on those. The second week on Surrealism, we will read Benjamin's Surrealism essay. And we'll see that Benjamin's Surrealism essay is written before Breton's Mad Love. And it is on a previous book similar to Mad Love, but actually significantly different, namely Nausea. So we're reading Mad Love and not Nausea because Mad Love's better. And because Benjamin deals with nausea, and it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so any volunteers on Breton's Mad Love for next time? Okay, that's one. Anyone else? It's a great work. So, by the way, we will see that Breton, true to the original Surrealist agenda, it's Hegel, Marx, and Freud.
I read it last week, but it frightened me.
Which Breton?
Mad Love.
Oh, Mad Love? It
Yeah.
frightened you. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No, it's sweet.
It was crazy. It was so tense.
It is intense. It is
Yeah.
intense. But it's less creepy than Nausea. Nausea's creepy.
Yeah.
Nausea's creepy.
How is it creepy? The Mad Love.
It's about a woman who is probably mentally ill, who the Surrealists treat as their spiritual muse, and they kind of abuse her, maybe, in the process of treating her that way. It comes through the text. And Benjamin's critical. And but Mad Love is much more about like actual love, and it's like Breton and his wife and his daughter, and it's like a real, and it's more about capitalism. It's more thematically about capitalism. Nausea is not. Okay, I don't have a second volunteer, that's okay. Can't tarry too much on this stuff. Okay, so we might be still catching up. Are we catching up from last week on some motifs in Baudelaire? Did we not work through all the notes, if I'm remembering correctly? We didn't go through.
No.
We did not, right? But the notes are extensive,
They are.
which they cannot be. Children, they can't be this extensive because there's not enough time for us to go through all of them. 2 or 3 bullet points, remember. Boom, boom, right? Thoughts, questions, passages, specific, like tune. That's what it needs to be, so that we can actually do a deep dive rather than try to cover everything. But anyway, let me bring up last week's. Because I do want to address the notes, but they also have to be manageable. Yoko is not here. Okay, so we're missing some of our comments. Who are my volunteers for this week?
It was Yoko and I.
For last week?
Yeah.
What about for this week?
Oh, this
For
week.
next week? Yeah.
No, for this one, yeah.
For
Yeah.
today?
Yeah. Oh, we got 3?
Well,
For
this
this-
for next Monday. Oh, sorry.
No, today.
Oh,
Who
today. Oh, I wasn't-
posted for today? Who posted for
I
today?
wasn't. I can do the next one.
Oh, okay. Good. All right. So, just to keep straight who's what. Well, what should we bring up? Let's go back to the text. about what we did not yet address. So we talked about the readership problem in lyric poetry and the crisis of subjectivity. We did talk about the traumatophile, like the character of Baudelaire. We got into that aspect of it. Okay, so because it is a second pass on Baudelaire by Benjamin after his first essay, he does return to some themes from that first essay, for instance, technology. We also have, I don't know if we talked about this last week, I don't think that we did, the reappearance of the concept of aura here. This is a term that's basically shows up only a few times in Benjamin's writings. Its Little History of Photography is the first time. The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is the second time. And the motifs in Baudelaire is the third time. All right, so even though this term has been kind of overused in Benjamin reception, it only shows up in a few of his writings. And it's meant to illustrate something. It's not meant to be a central category. Did we talk about aura? Have we not talked about aura? Okay, so that's what we needed to do from last week. All right, so aura, Benjamin defines it in the Little History of Photography and in the Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Almost word for word the same definition. And like I said, it's more descriptive and illustrative than it is a central concept or category or critical category. So it's kind of unfortunate that it's been taken up by people to be everything and anything about Benjamin. All right. So how does he define aura? The Work of Art essay is a little bit of a side project while he's working on the Arcades project. So the Arcades project is really informing the Work of Art essay, except in a way that is not immediately apparent to people. So aura is presence in space and time. So he calls it the strange weave. Of space and time. But what he's concerned about is not aura, but rather the decay, destruction, and disintegration of aura. He uses these words. And it's to describe what happens in capitalism. So in capitalism, there is a decay or destruction or disintegration. Also decline, he also uses the term decline. So what we're talking about is the decay, destruction, decline, and disintegration of presence in space and time. Now, why it comes up in the Little History of Photography and in the Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is that photography and cinema are meant to be, by Benjamin, understood as symptoms of this crisis of experience of space and time. Concerned with the decay, destruction, decline, disintegration of the experience of presence in space and time, which is really about our experience of space and time. So for something to be present in space and time, and for that to go into crisis, it means that our experience of space and time themselves is going into crisis. Now, did we look at, I thought that we did we look at the epigraph from Paul Valéry from the Work of Art essay? Right, about how neither space nor time nor matter nor energy are what they used to be from time immemorial in capitalism. And again, that's meant very literally. Space, time, matter, and energy are no longer what they once were. Are no longer. Being. It's an ontological claim. Now, we also know that Kant's critical understanding of the subject is that subjectivity requires notions of space and time. So to be a subject means being a subject in space and time. You can't be a subject without notions of space and time. However, notions of space and time have varied historically. They've varied within so-called Western civilization. They've varied across cultures. So space and time are constants, but they're variables. Meaning everyone has to experience, you have to have a notion of space and time. However, those notions, that experience of space and time can vary. Very, very radically. Nonetheless, to be an intelligent being, to be a subject, you have to have some idea of space and time. All right, so what those are is very variable. So we are experiencing a decay, destruction, decline, disintegration of space and time. What kind of space and time, though? Like, there's a specific experience of space and time that is going into decay and disintegration. Bourgeois space and time. Bourgeois space and time. Bourgeois space and time, historically bourgeois space and time. Not class. This is in the class denomination. It's historical, meaning there was a transformation from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. So medieval Christendom had its notion of space and time, and then the Renaissance brings about a transformation of space and time. So what is that space and time? Transformation of space and time. Bourgeois space and time is the space and time of labor. We talked about the commodity form, labor. The commodity form of the value of labor. 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 So our social relations, our bourgeois social relations, which are relations to and with others, nature, and ourselves. Space and time are functions of our relation to things, according to Kant. Are practical relations to things. So bourgeois space and time is in our activity. It's in our practices. It's not in our theories. It's not a way of thinking. It's a way of being. It's a way of acting. And since we're alive, our being is tied to our activity. And that's why Bergson will be important as a so-called vitalist philosopher of thinking, because being is all about action for Bergson. So labor is the commodity form of value of activity in society. We're always finding new ways to value our activity. Society is finding new ways to find value in our activity all the time. This is so-called commodification. The commodification of labor is a never-ending process. I was watching a podcast with the venture capitalist tech bros. I don't even know their names off the top of my head. One of them is David Sachs. He's in the Trump administration. He's the crypto czar. Anyway, but they're all friends of Elon Musk, whatever. And they used to be Democrats, but now they're kind of neither party or whatever, even though they supported Trump in the election because they were upset with Biden for whatever reason. And they were talking about like socialism and capitalism and Marxism and blah, 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 blah. And technology and AI, and will AI destroy society because people won't have jobs? And what they said was, well, we will just have to find new ways of valuing our time. So they're better Marxists than 99.99% of Marxists because they know, they understand that that's the point. That is the point. It's about the value of time. Okay, so decay, disintegration, decline, these terms, strange weave of space and time. Destruction of aura means that presence in capitalism, presence in space and time becomes self-contradictory. Indeed, experience of space and time becomes self-contradictory. So what we're looking for in art and literature is how the self-contradiction of experience is being registered. And indeed, maybe even thematized in modernism, in modernist visual art, in modernist literature, in modernist music. So Wagner is the first modernist in music, and part of what makes Wagner so seductive is that it's totally trippy at the level of the experience of time in comparison to classical music before. And it has it's a forerunner for a lot of 20th century play with the experience of time by avant-garde musicians, also in jazz and in popular music, in fact. It's sort of everywhere. We kind of take it for granted, but it's everywhere. Because music, of course, is a temporal, durational medium. It thematizes time. But Bedin doesn't really write about music. He makes some mention of it, but Adorno writes about music. His friend Adorno is a musician and writes about music. So they have a dialogue about this stuff. And Benjamin is the literature guy, and Adorno is the music guy. One last note I'll make on that. Brecht, I think I mentioned Brecht. So Brecht is known for his collaborations with Kurt Weill, but also he collaborated with Hans Eisler, another musician. And Eisler became the composer of the East German, the German Democratic Republic national anthem. He wrote the music for that. He also knew Adorno very well, and they co-wrote a book together on composing for the film when they were both living in Hollywood. Anyway, so music is in there. Okay, so technology. So one way of thinking about capitalism, so we define capitalism, the contradiction. This is Marx. Marx defines capitalism. It's the bourgeois social relations. Contradicted by the industrial forces of production. but this is not two different things. It's not two different things. It's two sides of the same thing, namely capitalist production. So the capitalist mode of production is characterized by this contradiction between the the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. But the bourgeois social relations of production and the industrial forces of production. Again. Okay. So we're talking about technology as not the industrial forces of production. So we talked about reification, Lukács, reification. The reification is the breakdown of the subject-object dialectic. The dialectic of subject and object, by which the thing in itself becomes an object. And that this process of objectification is also a process of subjectification, meaning it's how we become subjects. So the subject and the object arise together in this process. And that this is the bourgeois dialectic of labor. Right, so Marx famously wrote that the German idealist dialectic of subject and object is a dialectic of labor. Meaning it describes subjectivity for all time, and yet really it's about this time. It's the bourgeois dialectic of labor. And that reification Lukács's idea of reification, it means literally thingification. Is when the object reverts to a thing. So it's about the breakdown of the subject-object dialectic, in which the object reverts back to a thing, and the subject takes on a thing-like character. So the subject takes on a thing-like character. So it's the phantom objectivity. And it is the reified subjectivity. And we've discussed this because reification might sound like bad, in the same way that commodity fetishism sounds bad. You know, like something like, oh, don't be a commodity fetishist. You know, don't reify. No, we do. We do. We live in commodity fetishism. It is what makes us subjects at all. It is our entire cosmology of our social relations in this view. And because this cosmology of bourgeois social relations is in contradiction, is in self-contradiction, and therefore in a crisis, this reification is something that we must necessarily do. We do it. We can't help but do it. We reify things. We thingify things. Meaning, our subjectivity is reified, and objects have a phantom-like quality. I think did we talk about the phantasmagoria yet? Have we gotten to phantasmagoria? We may not have. Okay, that's coming. Or I think it might be in this week's reading. Phantasmagoria is in this week's reading. Okay, so we'll talk about it today. Yeah.
So how is this different from like thing theory? Because you were saying the other day that
It's related.
that Benjamin is kind of like his historical materialism kind of puts him in like a different, like opposing to thing theory.
Well, yes, but he predates it also.
Okay.
So thing theory comes more out of like Heidegger.
And he's later.
Yes, Heidegger's later, and Heidegger's actually reacting to Lukács. So Heidegger is saying, no, Marxism is wrong about this. It's not a specific thing to capitalism, it's Western metaphysics in general, and that Marxism is just trying to kind of complete the process of Western metaphysics, whereas Heidegger wants to register a kind of dissent from Western metaphysics and say that that Marxism is going to be like ultra-capitalism. It's going to have all the, like if we follow Marx, we're going to have the full onslaught of reification, that we're not going to overcome it because Heidegger rejects Hegel. And in rejecting Hegel, he's rejecting the idea that we're going to overcome reification on the basis of reification itself. Overcome capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. Instead, Heidegger's like, no, we have to be circumspect, we have to like not forget being, we have to sort of look at Van Gogh's painting of the peasant's shoes and think about everything that's left out of capitalist metaphysics and whatever. So Benjamin, reification is not a bad thing, nor is it simply a good thing. It's a dialectical thing. It's a self-contradictory thing. And he is interested, however, in how we're going to overcome reification on the basis of reification itself. That means a critical notion of reification, rather than either an affirmative or a condemnatory view of reification. So the way we normally talk about the critical view, critical usually means like negative and debunking and disputing or opposing. No, critical in the Kantian sense of exploring the conditions of possibility for both why something is the case, but also the exploration of possibility of changing it. Right? So it's not meant to be just descriptive, it's meant to be critical in the sense of pointing to how it will be changed. And why this is important is that, of course, literature, art, reifies things. It absolutely does. Like, it reifies things perhaps even more so than the commodity economy does in capitalism. Since the commodity economy in capitalism is all about fungibility, whereas art is about like trying to fix something as like an irreducible thing that can't be like measured. Right? And so the question is, what is that about? And recall that Marxism in Benjamin's time is very much suspicious of art. Like I was just looking at some stupid thing. What was it? Might have been some Twitter post about me. It's like, well, he likes art, so he's not a Marxist. Yeah, like it comes down to that. He likes art, so that means he's not a Marxist. No, that's just completely not true. Like this is like, there's some Stalinist type, like total socialist realist type Stalinist type nonsense. Anyway, so exactly what Benjamin is trying to rescue Marxism from. No, it's like that. It's that bad. It's getting really good though. It's getting really bad and really good.
Are you only supposed to like Modern Times or something? Like
No, you're not even supposed to like that. You can't like it too much. In other words, like you can use it as like agitprop or something. Like no, because they like culture, not art. Because art is a bourgeois reification. Art is a bourgeois mystification. Right? And so like culture, like just like the way people talk, like that's as aesthetic as you have to be. That if you try to like reify it and make it into art, then that's the bourgeois thing, and that's bad. Right? So it's dissolving art into like social practice. I mean, look, who were SAIC is all about this. It's all about this. It's all about this. Yes, it's all about this. Yeah. Art is reduced to research, epistemology, and practice. Blah. No. Benjamin is here to say no. That is capitalism. Liquidates art into culture and just turns it into a fungible unit of value to be translated in the system.
Then what is art outside capitalism? subjective.
Well, it isn't.
Exactly. Exactly.
It isn't, right? And so, but the thing is, we don't have an outside of capitalism.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I have like.
Art is a bourgeois category that emerged historically.
Yes.
And who knows what we're going to do after capitalism. But we're still in bourgeois society, bourgeois social relations, however contradicted by the industrial forces of production. Who knows what we're going to do after capitalism? The question is, what's the significance of what we do now in capitalism? Is it something that you dismiss as bourgeois ideology, or is it a real symptom of contradiction that we have to work through? Hegel, 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 Hegel. Marxist Hegelian he is. We have to work through commodity fetishism. We can't just sort of say, oh no, no commodity fetishism. We want to be like the peasants. That's Heidegger. That's Heidegger. Heidegger likes the peasants. No. First of all, the peasants are subjects of capital too. Right, so all you're doing there is a kind of romantic reification of culture. Whereas art is self-consciously reified. It's self-consciously what it is. It doesn't hide behind culture, praxis, blah, 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 blah. Right? The culture is the more insidious ideology because it pretends it's something else. It pretends it's an anthropological category that is universal and that is outside of capitalism. It's not. That's a total reification of capitalism itself. It's romantic capitalism, and including romantic anti-capitalism, which is romantic capitalism. So, yeah, critical reification. That's what we have to keep in mind. That Benjamin's project is critical reification, meaning, okay, we are subjects of reification. We have reified subjectivity. So it's always this tricky thing about theory, like thing theory. It's a tricky thing with philosophy and theory, which is that there's a fine line, we might say, between the descriptive and then the normative, right? So like affirmative, like so you describe things, and in describing them, you might affirm them. So what drops out is usually the critical aspect. And so the point is that, of course, Heidegger's philosophy is trying to grasp something, and all the descendants of Heidegger's philosophy are trying to grasp something, and maybe they're even trying to grasp it critically, but they end up sort of becoming merely descriptive or even normative. And especially insofar as they try to abstract the situation outside of capitalism. In other words, where it becomes this kind of philosophical thing that was always true, but we just didn't know it, and now we know it, right? So, again, the historical specificity of the way things appear to us now, modernity. Like we spent 3 weeks on Baudelaire for this reason. We want to know about modernity. We want to know about the specific phenomena of modernity. Why things appear differently in the 19th century than they did before. And yet not treated as a dead end, not treated as a kind of a cul-de-sac, not treated as this unfortunate hell that we've landed in. That would be easy, because it's clearly the case. However, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to overcome it? How are we going to get out of it? And so the idea is that we're going to have to do it on its own basis, in its own terms, through the appearances, through the way the world appears to us, through this subjectivity. So another problem with like object-oriented ontology on the one hand, thing theory on the other hand, is that attributing subjectivity to everything, so we have a phrase here in the Central Park, the object opening its eyes under the gaze of the subject. Okay, so the problem with panpsychism, which is an old philosophical position, attributing subjectivity to everything, is that no, they're not. Everything is not a subject. Like this table's not a subject the way I'm a subject. Meaning, the historical task, like, no, right? It's like, yes, it is a subject, meaning I interact with it. Sure, yeah, but no, we can't be a comrade in the struggle. You can't. You know, like, yes, maybe, sure, the Soviet Union trained dolphins to plant mines on U.S. ships in the Cold War, right? And we can try to enlist everything and the animals. You know, we can summon up the hosts of spirits to try to overcome capitalism. We've got to deal with each other. We do, actually. Humans are special. They are. Humans are special. They are. They're not. You can't have this conversation with anything else. You can only do this with other humans. Right. So this is Kant's rejection of Spinoza. Hylozoism. Right? That the problem with that kind of monism is that if you attribute consciousness to everything, then actually nothing has consciousness. Which also we feel. We also feel like we don't have consciousness. Well, we better hope that we do. Otherwise, we're going to be in this shit forever, and we're going to be in this shit forever but not know it. We're just going to be victims of it, not subjects of it. Okay, so art, because it's controversial for Benjamin to be trying to write a 1,000-page book on Baudelaire. What the hell is a Marxist doing that? Why? Baudelaire, who cares? He's like this fucked up guy, antisocial, decadent, misogynist, like everything you could say. He's anti-Semitic, he's racist, it's like everything bad. He's like, seems like a fascist, you know? Right? And so why? Why should we care about Baudelaire? Because we're all Baudelaire. Because we are all Baudelaire. We are. And the Marxist view of fascism isn't about other people. It's about us. It's endemic. That's why it does things like reify race. It's what we do all the time. Okay. So technology is the reification of the industrial forces of production. Coming back around to it. So technology is, the threat of technology is that we reify it. We don't see technology as a social relation that is in self-contradiction and crisis, but we rather see it as a thing. We reify it. We treat it as if it's an agent and a subject. It is not. It is a social relation from which we've become alienated and therefore reify. Art is technological. Art is about technique. It is about form. And it does reify those things. It reifies technique, it reifies form. It does. It is what the socialist realists complained about modernism. It's formalism. It is. Well, what isn't in capitalism? What isn't formalism? What isn't the reification of form in capitalism? It's the reification of the commodity form, that's for sure. It's the reification of our forms of social relations, for sure. So the thing is, I guess to use a term, to lean into it. What would it mean to lean into the reification of technology, rather than try to resist it a la Heidegger, and go to the Black Forest and try to hang out with the peasants. Think that the most important thing of Van Gogh is like, you know, the peasant's shoes as some kind of artifact, some anthropological, archaeological datum, as opposed to obviously Van Gogh's a modernist painter, and it is formalist, and it is decadent, and it is everything else. So, reification of technology, we do it all the time. And we blame technology, and we also seek salvation through technology. Now, where it goes in terms of art, so in this time that Benjamin's writing these things, the Soviet Union is putting people to death for being modernist writers and artists. The Soviet Union is putting people in jail, putting them in insane asylums, and killing them. So blaming the art. Blaming the art. On the other hand, there are movements associated with like socialism and communism, also with fascism and other things. There are movements that claim that art's going to be the salvation of society. That somehow the artistic movement embodies a cultural principle that will save society. But that it is a new kind of practice that will be the way out. That's also not true. So technology, including art as a form of technology, it is neither the cause of our doom nor will it save us. We can't blame it for what we're dealing with, nor will it save us. What are we in now? We're in some kind of porn hysteria now. People are like convinced that internet porn is destroying people's minds and sex lives and psychology and civilization itself. Maybe it is, but where did it come from? Why does it exist? And what if we all are subjects of internet porn? What if that's just who we are? Whether we use it or not. What if our subjectivity in capitalism gears us to this kind of experience? Right? You can't blame the technology for the experience. The experience has to speak to a subject that is there. Right? So this is what we do. We blame things. But those are reifications. And we have to think about where they came from and where they're going, rather than just reifying the thing simply and turning it into the demon or the angel. Alright, so you guys don't know anything about Baudelaire, so you need to know some things, since some biographical references are made. So, Baudelaire is what we would now call BDSM. Meaning, what does he go to prostitutes for? To be beaten. Oh, well, you can kind of tell. Right? So, no, I mean, he's got a very masochistic and sadistic kind of sensibility to him. There's definitely a lot of that going on, right? And it's why his misogyny is not straightforward. Meaning, he doesn't deprecate women, he puts them on a pedestal, which is just as bad. Right. Misogyny and feminism are two sides of the same coin. Right. Women are neither the problem nor are they the solution. So that's what you need to know about these anecdotes and trying to figure out Baudelaire's like personal life. So he had a mistress, an Algerian mistress, who was also a prostitute. So that's your Baudelaire biography in a nutshell. And and they had a sadomasochistic or BDSM relationship. Again, he's one of us. He's very much one of us. He's a modern. More or less. So that brings in the psychoanalytical. Now I wanted to recall for us the Mourning and Melancholia, ambivalence. I know that this is many weeks ago and we've been covering a lot of material, but if we recall Freud on Mourning and Melancholia, and if we're treating Baudelaire as a melancholic, spleen, subject of melancholy, also a manic, also a manic. That this is, in psychoanalytic terms, it expresses ambivalence. And ambivalence is not neutrality or lukewarm wishy-washiness. It's opposite feelings coexisting simultaneously. So love and hate, desire and fear, sadism and masochism, enjoyment and disgust, attraction and repulsion. Right? We're attracted to things that we're repulsed by. We read some poems by Baudelaire. He talks about this. So he is a case. He is a psychoanalytic case. He's on Freud's couch. His poetry is what he's saying in therapy, for sure. Right? And Freud is hastily writing the notes. It's like, this is a real case.
Did Freud ever write about Baudelaire?
I don't think so. He writes about Shakespeare. He writes about German poets. Now that you mention it, no, I don't think so. I think he writes about Renaissance artists and writers. He writes about German romantics, also Shakespeare. I feel like he did write something about a French. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think it's Baudelaire. What were you saying? What's it?
Oh, there is a book about Baudelaire and Freud,
Of course.
like pairing them together.
Yeah. So, ambivalence, how to understand, okay, so because we dealt with Freud very early on and we're bringing Freud in with those motifs in Baudelaire and with Central Park, less so with the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire. Now we need to connect up Marx and Freud. Meaning, what is the Marxist approach to Freud? The Marxist approach to Freud is to see Freud's psychoanalytic subject as a symptom of capitalism. Meaning, Freud is describing the psychology of capitalism. He's not describing psychology for all time, but he's describing the specific psychology of capitalism, namely the internal conflict of the conscious and the unconscious, the content of neuroses being ambivalence, unworked through pre-Oedipal psychological material, neurosis being liminal, like if it's not strictly Oedipal, then it's liminal between psychosis and Oedipal. Narcissistic, right? So narcissism as a particular feature of psychology under capitalism, and Freud, if we date things. Marx and Baudelaire are 1848 figures. They're contemporaries. And then we have this period of World War I and the revolutions that follow. And again, understanding capitalism as the Industrial Revolution. First Industrial Revolution, then Baudelaire is really registering something way ahead of time. So the Second Industrial Revolution is, of course, the time of Marxism. It's a mass movement. It's also the time of Freud. Freud's discoveries are all pre-World War I, and then he sort of develops some ideas after World War I, but all the essential stuff was developed before World War I. so the idea is that Baudelaire is sort of ahead of the curve in terms of his sensibility, in terms of his psychology, as well as his kind of aesthetic preoccupations. Right, so that modernism originates circa 1848, but high modernism is the period of the late 19th and early 20th century. So everything that we think of as like modernism in a very clearly recognizable form is from that period of high modernism. And then we get late modernism in the 20th century. But that's the basic schema here. Chronologically, is that Baudelaire is way ahead of the curve, and also maybe even ahead of the curve of Freud. So Freud dies in 1940 or 41, I forgot when he dies. So of course, we have World War II. Benjamin himself dies. Right around in the early days of World War II. Starting with like the late and the post-Freud is really concerned with narcissism. So Morning of Melancholia, his essay on narcissism, these are later works. And then the post-Freud psychoanalysts are very much focused on what Freud would have considered narcissistic conditions. So including his daughter, Anna Freud, but also others, Adler, pretty much everything post-Freud. Lacan, for sure, right? That the pre-Oedipal psychology comes to the fore towards the end of Freud's life and for the post-Freudians. So in that respect, Baudelaire as a kind of narcissistic subject is way ahead of the curve. So Freud's himself more the product of the era of classical neuroses, Oedipal complex neuroses, but then in his own lifetime he's seeing a shift to pre-Oedipal phenomena. Right, so again, recall from Freud that melancholia as a condition is sometimes treatable, but often not treatable by psychoanalysis. Right, so it's a limit case for psychoanalysis, and yet it is really more characteristic of the mental illness that we see in the 20th century rather than the classical neuroses. The classical neuroses are seen less frequently, and pre-Oedipal phenomena, narcissistic conditions, more the case. Okay, so sorry for all that, but anyway, spleen, I will just say that this is the section of the Flowers of Evil that Benjamin himself translated. So he didn't translate all of the Flowers of Evil. He translated the section on spleen. He focused on that. And in so doing, he followed in the wake of Stefan Jorge. Stefan Jorge, who's a major German modernist poet. And also the Jorge Circle. There's like a group of poets around Stefan Jorge. And of course, the classic translation of Baudelaire into German is by Jorge. And he's like a major poet. And of course, this translation is very good. So we talked about this, why does Benjamin have to retranslate? Because part of Benjamin's agenda, if we recall the task of the translator, is that he wants French to impact the German language. Yorga, on the other hand, tends to, even though it's a great translation of Baudelaire, it tends to assimilate Baudelaire into German Romanticism, and therefore kind of fudge the difference between Romanticism and modernism. And why that's important is for historical reasons. Meaning, we've certainly talked about this before, about the earlier history. The transition from classicism to romanticism in the early 19th century, and then realism and modernism as parallel outgrowths of romanticism. So Benjamin thinks that there's a real barrier to grasping capitalism insofar as German literature doesn't register modernity, including modernism. So that's part of, we're going to talk about this when we do the surrealism essay in a couple of weeks. He'll bring this out. I've been foreshadowing this for a while, but he'll bring it out in the beginning of that essay very explicitly about the disadvantage and advantage of being a German reading French modernist literature. And I don't know if we talked about this before. So the First Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution. First Industrial Revolution is England, first of all, and then France. And the Second Industrial Revolution is Germany. So in the understanding that Benjamin has, Germany is backward. So Germany is backward, and then it's catching up. And it's catching up in that high modernist period. But also it's catching up more in practice than in theory, especially as regards like the self-understanding of art and literature. But the self-understanding of art and literature in Germany is still romantic. It's not sufficiently engaged with Baudelairean modernity, capitalism, modernism. And so part of his agenda in translating Baudelaire is to try to correct for that. So you need a translation of Baudelaire that isn't reassimilating Baudelaire into his own romantic background. But this is part of the dialogue. This is part of his concerns as a critic, as a theorist. All right, let me go to you guys' notes. Who should go first, based on how you guys divided them? Okay, volunteers were Tommy and Lena. Yes. Okay. Yes. And remind me of your name. Sophia. So you also posted that. But you were okay. So who were my official presenters again? Okay. Okay. All right. You guys. And then okay. So we sort of got 3. That's good. That's fine. So if you guys had a chance to look over the notes. Let's try and figure out who we should start with. Maybe we'll just do it in the order that they're here. So Sophia, if you want to guide us through the things you wanted to raise.
Yeah, sure. I mean, these are kind of more like comprehension questions.
Sure.
Realistically. But, yeah, so I guess my primary questions are on fragments 31 and 39, which is like mystification of Baudelaire as an arbitrary Baudelaire method. This is in the law. Also, it's some questions. Is Benjamin's positioning of allegory is about life and is it Baudelaire and his position against mystification as an fascism? And like his reflections on
Okay, so let's talk about this. So again, Marx. Marx famously wrote about prostitution in regards to capitalism, and the way Marx wrote about prostitution was as regards the socialist or communist demand in the 19th century, the pre-Marxian socialist and communist demand to abolish the family. So what Marx said about this was he analogized it to the socialist and communist demand to abolish private property. So what he said was, if you abolish private property, then you just make everyone the wage slave of the state. And similarly, if you abolish the family, the patriarchal family, which is what socialists and communists wanted to do, that you will potentially only just turn women into the common prostitutes of society as a whole. Which has happened. Just in case you guys didn't know,
And
that has
queerness,
happened.
because in queer theory, they offer queer Marxism also, that points to basically it's like everything is open, right?
Right. Yes. However, okay, but let's be careful about this. So the reason that Marx approached it this way is that he was concerned with how the socialists and communists were in themselves just expressing an ideology of capitalism. In other words, socialism and communism were themselves projections of capitalism. That he called it the negation of the negation, meaning that people experienced capitalism as the negation of bourgeois social relations, but then the socialists and communists just came back with a negation of the negation. So the bourgeois ideal of elective affinities and like choose who you want to marry and a kind of monogamous relationship, that capitalism had belied that, had sort of not only belied it but destroyed it. So Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, he writes, communists are accused by their opponents of wanting to abolish the family, but it is capitalism itself that is abolishing the family. It also has to do with how Marx, he called communism the real movement of history. That was misinterpreted and also taken up as propaganda to mean the future. He said, no, communism is the real movement of history in capitalism. And that he also called communism a dogmatic abstraction that is not the society of the future, but is rather a one-sided principle against the private property principle within capitalism. Yeah, so everything that you've ever heard about Marxism is wrong. That's the first thing you need to know coming into a class of mine. Everything you've ever heard about Marxism is wrong. Profoundly. Okay, so everything that people call Marxism is actually what Marx criticized. So he's the critic of socialism and communism. He's not the author of it. And he certainly is not the affirmer of it. Not at all. He wants to know where it came from. It comes from capitalism. And how it expresses the contradiction of capitalism and points beyond capitalism, but without giving us an image of what beyond capitalism is actually going to be. So that's why, as Juliet Mitchell put it in a famous essay, Women, the Longest Revolution in the 60s, she said, you can't just take the condition of women now and say that the opposite of that would be liberation, because it would not be. And in fact, capitalism is quite capable of reversing things. In other words, of offering the negation of what exists as if it's liberation, whereas it's just going to be more capitalism. Yes? Right, so anyway, the writer is a prostitute, everyone's a prostitute. Wage slavery is prostitution. And indeed, prostitution is inseparable from wage labor, from wage slavery. If you guys didn't know this, an important thing about the Industrial Revolution is who were the first workers in the factories? Women. Because men consider factory labor to be effeminizing. It's like against masculinity to work in a factory under a boss like that. That's only for women and children. It was women and children who were the first employees of the factory. And then men. Yes. See, we've buried this history. We think that women entered the workforce in the 60s. It's ridiculous. Women have always been in the workforce. in the paid wage labor workforce. And of course, prostitution was inseparable from it. Because what was the Christian response to women working in factories? It's bad, it's unchristian, because women are going to be taken advantage of sexually as a result of this working for a wage, which is of course true. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Jumps off of Sophia's question, but I would love some explanation of what he means by allegory. It
Okay,
seems so
allegory. No.
like, I
Good,
did not
good,
understand
good
that.
for bringing it back to that, because that is an important point. So we dealt with parable in Kafka. Allegory, though, allegory is a different concept. So allegory, it's kind of a Renaissance concept, and it both is and is not the case now with modernism, that art is allegorical. It actually speaks to the question of realism. Right? So realism, meaning how is art an allegory of reality? And how the allegorization of reality is like realism. So it's the difference between symbol, metaphor, allegory. Right? These are different things. So symbol is the combination of things. Like literally, that's the term. That's what the Greek words mean. So symbol is like the mashup of things. Metaphor is like the replacement of one thing by another thing. And allegory is closer to what we've discussed with the mimetic faculty, which is that allegory sort of imitates the object, or imitates the phenomenon. So when we've talked about exemplary but not a model, art literature is exemplary but not a model, that what it means to treat something as an exemplar is to treat it as allegorical. So we are going to pull everything back together, and why on the mimetic faculty we did it early, but why it's coming next time, is because non-sensuous similarity. So similarity that is not sensuous similarity. Allegory is an example of non-sensuous similarity. Allegory because it's structurally similar without being sensuously similar. All right, so I think that I mentioned when we did on the mimetic faculty and also the experience in poverty piece, that we have two twin concepts that we have to keep in mind: constellation and construction. All right, so constellation is the way things seemingly spontaneously appear, whereas construction is more of a kind of deliberate attempt to bring things into constellation. Right, so allegory, the spontaneous appearance of reality as allegorical. This would capture the transition from medieval Christian to Renaissance humanist. Right, so that sort of everything that happens is a sort of allegory of the meaning of God's intention, right? How to sort of interpret the world, also what stories are meant to do, like how are stories supposed to deliver kind of truth or kind of wisdom. Go ahead.
I was also talking about how allegory functions specifically like in the Baroque context, like in the 17th century. I was hoping you could
Okay.
expand on that, if you could say.
Okay, so yes. Okay, so all right, so this is where we get into a little bit of stages of the emergence of bourgeois society. Okay, so Renaissance is the beginning, but then we have the Baroque. And Benjamin's book, that he wrote before this book that he never wrote is The Origin of German Trauerspiel. And it is supposed to be about like that era. It's supposed to be about the era of the Protestant Reformation and the religious wars and also the vernacularization of the Bible, right? And the relationship between the vernacularization of the Bible and the emergence of bourgeois literature. Right, so mass literacy becomes a thing. It becomes possible to translate the Bible into the vernacular where we'll have a readership. Prior to that, it wouldn't have really made any sense to translate the Bible because most people were illiterate, including the aristocrats, and so it was fine that only the priests could read the Bible. Right, so the emergence of a culture of mass literacy makes it both possible and necessary to translate the Bible into the vernacular, and transformations in literature come alongside that, or contemporaneous with that, including the emergence of the novel form that we've talked about previously, and other popular kind of bourgeois art and literature. So Shakespeare, Elizabethan like art and literature is like a key kind of bourgeois moment, sort of obviously, but also England's ahead of the curve. So England and the Netherlands are ahead of the curve on bourgeois society, not only on capitalism, in this view anyway. So the Baroque is your kind of second stage early bourgeois, if we were to put it that way, whereas the 17th and 18th centuries are more like Enlightenment, and so are more sort of familiar to us as, recognizably kind of modern in the bourgeois sense, if not yet in the capitalist sense. Classicism. What do we usually mean when we mean classicism? It's really the self-understanding that comes rather late. So it comes in the late 1600s and 1700s, and then sort of appropriates and incorporates like the Renaissance forward, right? So it's so classicism is post-Baroque, but it sort of elides the specific character of the Baroque. And okay, so back to the Protestant Reformation. Right, so Protestantism, unlike Catholicism, Protestantism is about like a worldly mission and God's incomplete creation that we're supposed to participate in. And so the appearance of the world changes from traditional Christianity. So the world appears different to the bourgeois subject than it did before. And nature appears differently. So the way that nature is allegorical changes. All right, so allegory is meant to be a category that helps grasp, or a concept that helps grasp the transition. So the changing character of allegory can give you a phenomenal realm in which bourgeois subjectivity can be shown to emerge. Right, so when we look at like Renaissance writers and Renaissance artists, it's like they are Christian, they're clearly Christian, and yet you can see the humanism coming through. And so there's something else going on, and yet everything still is basically a Christian allegory. Yeah.
Despite an ongoing relationship and intimacy, is it a lot of those expressed like in Baroque through like classical?
That's right. So there's classicism and then there's the classical. So classical antiquity, the idea is that classical antiquity is a little bit of a creation of the Renaissance and of the Baroque, and it is about these theological questions, right? So it's about like the debates within Christian theology and whether Christian theology can be assimilated to this longer humanist tradition that's traced back to the Greeks and the Romans, or whether there's another kind of Christian kind of principle, or I was just thinking about this René Girard insanity, Christian anthropology. I think Ross Douthat, do you know Ross Douthat? He's a columnist for the New York Times. He's another one of these people. Anyway, but not, I don't think he's a Catholic, I think he's a Protestant, but he talks about Christian anthropology, meaning that like literally the New Testament is like a unique kind of anthropology, right? And it's kind of like, well, but wait a second. The meaning of the gospel changed pretty fundamentally between the late Roman era, the medieval era, the Renaissance, and then the Baroque. Right, there are significant transformations in what the gospel as allegory would mean. Right, so you get an increasingly humanistic interpretation of the gospel of the New Testament. Right, and that again, the Baroque is sort of that transition, right? Before the more atheistic Enlightenment, basically, of the 17th and 18th centuries, where it flips. So instead of humanism being like a Christian allegory, Christianity becomes a humanist allegory. So it sort of flips. Right, so you have a Christian appropriation of a classical humanism, and then it flips into a humanistic appropriation of Christianity.
So what is allegory in the time of Baudelaire?
It's in crisis. Okay, finally. Yeah, okay, so bring it full circle. The tradition of allegory, the bourgeois tradition of allegory, is in crisis in the 19th century, meaning that Romanticism is about despairing of the possibility of allegorical meaning. And then Baudelaire modernism is about, oh no, it's not that we are without an allegory, it's that we have a different allegory. We have to look at the world around us and treat this reality as allegorical. So basically it's the question of, what would an allegory of capitalism be? So an allegory of capitalism would have to be different than a traditional Christian allegory or a humanist allegory, a bourgeois humanist allegory. That's why it appears to be an allegory not of humanity, but of inhumanity. Okay, that's why precisely these figures, that's what brings it around to Kafka. Like to go full circle, and why Kafka is associated with existentialism is that there's a kind of radical questioning of the human, of anthropos.
Can we look at something in fragment 13
Yes.
on allegory?
Let's.
It starts with that which is touched by the allegorical attention. And he's writing so poetically, it's like kind of...
Hey, wait, in section 13.
The Central Park.
Yeah, Central Park, sorry. I thought I was queued up. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's read the whole thing. Because usually we have to do that. In Baudelaire, the poet for the first time makes known his claim to an exhibition value. Okay, this is, by the way, a term from the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So exhibition value as opposed to cult value. So cult value would be the affirmative value, and exhibition value would be the critical value. Okay. Claim to an exhibition value. Baudelaire was his own impresario, meaning he curates his own work. Right? So he's constantly doing his own curation and promotion, like that's inseparable from the work itself. The loss of aura or halo, loss of the aureole, but aura, affects the poet first and foremost, hence his mythomania. Okay, so in trying to, in dealing with the destruction of aura, what Baudelaire does is try to restore the aura. Right, so there's a bit of an attempt to do that in the question is how, right? So mythomania, meaning, here's another, sorry, what a little tangents we have to go down. Myth. What's myth? Okay, so myth. So myth is the opposite of enlightenment, at least in the way that Benjamin uses this language. So enlightenment is like the disenchantment of the world, whereas myth is the enchantment of the world. However, how can you really separate myth and enlightenment? You can't, as simply as that. So this is another Hegelianism. So Hegel, but also not just Hegel, also a more archaeological or anthropological, humanistic view of things, is that every past myth was an enlightenment. So, and every enlightenment eventually becomes myth. So it's this dialectic of myth and enlightenment. Or to use a term from Horkheimer and Adorno, the dialectic of enlightenment. Meaning, enlightenment has become its own myth in the 19th century. So the bourgeois enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, of the 1600s and 1700s, has itself reverted into a myth in the 19th century, or become an ideology. Okay, so mythomania, meaning that we're trying to give meaning to capitalism, and in trying to give meaning to capitalism, we are ideologizing it, which also means mythologizing it. So everything that that Baudelaire produces apparently traditional lyric poetry, on the one hand, formally. And we talked about this, Lukács's theory of the novel defines lyric poetry as a kind of complement to the novel. So in the novel, time is a character, it's about the thematization of time, whereas the lyric poem is about the moment, sort of taken out of the flow of time and sort of monumentalized or objectified. So it's an attempt to sort of freeze a moment in time in the form of an image. And that again brings in allegory. Meaning, is any attempt to allegorize itself a kind of mythologization of reality in capitalism specifically? And again, why? Because space and time we can't take for granted, therefore any image we can't take for granted. We're eventually getting to this category, the dialectical image. Dialectical image, which is again this critical reification. Meaning action becoming an image. So when action becomes an image, that is a reification of action, and yet it happens in a self-contradictory way, and therefore we can treat the image dialectically. Okay, so in attempting to allegorize modernity, namely capitalism, Baudelaire is inevitably mystifying it, even mythifying it, mythologizing it, rendering it ideological. And again, this is why the socialist realists are anti-Baudelaire, and why they were anti-Kafka. And yet Benjamin is like, yes, but actually that's important. What they're doing is important, because actually we must do that. We can't help but do that. It's not like there's an alternative to that. Okay, sorry, mythomania. The pedantic theorems with which l'art polar was thought, not only by its defenders at the time, not to speak of its present ones, but especially by literary history, issue simply and appropriately in the phrase, sensibility is the true subject of poetry. Sensibility is by its nature suffering. If it experiences its highest degree of concretion, its richest determination, in eroticism, it finds its ultimate consummation, which coincides with its transfiguration in passion. The poetics of l'art polar enters smoothly into the poetic passion of the fleur du mal. Okay, so art for art's sake. So why is the richest determination in eroticism? Because eroticism is inevitably, at least in this Baudelairean mode, it's the reification of the body. right? So the body is not just a sort of functional moment of an act, but is the thing. Right, so the reification of art is inseparable from the reification of the human being, including the human being as an erotic object. Flowers adorn the particular stations of this Mount Calvary. So this is the Passion. When he says capital P Passion, that's Jesus, right? That's the stations of the cross. So I mentioned that he fluidly goes back and forth between Jewish and Christian theology. But the flowers that adorn the particular stations of this Mount Calvary are the flowers of evil. Have you guys been to a Catholic church? Catholic church. Okay, cool. All right. I don't know if Protestant churches, do they do the Stations of the Cross in the Protestant church? I don't think so. Yeah, the Catholic Church has the Stations of the Cross. So it's like these images of like, okay, now they're nailing the thorns into his head, and now he's carrying the cross, and now they're nailing him to the cross, and now they're poking him with the spear when he's up on the cross. Like, it's pretty gruesome, actually, right? And in some ways, the more gruesome, the better. Like, because sometimes they try to make it more like light, you know, like children's book illustration style, and it's like, yeah, no. And the carved Jesus on the cross in my church, like his body was like really gnarly, like it was like really like you saw like muscles and bones, and you know, it was all about like the physicality, you know. Have you guys seen The Passion of the Christ? Mel Gibson? You guys see this crap, children? I'm sorry. You have to be of your time. You have to see the horrible anti-Semitic Mel Gibson movie, because it does have its little anti-Semitism thrown in there gratuitously. But basically, it's like the story of the Passion is like to have a body means to suffer. It's like, okay, like basically your body is just like a source of infinite suffering, right? It's like the Passion. Anyway, and so that's like, yeah. So children go into church and they look at these images on the wall, and it's like, and it's erotic too. It is. It's erotic. It is erotic. It is.
Wouldn't that make it appropriate for Baudelaire?
Total. Yeah, and look, France, modernism. France is a Catholic country. France is a Catholic country. It's like a very Catholic country. Very Catholic country. So, yeah, of course, Baudelaire is not a Catholic, like, believer or something. He totally is. Totally. And again, the question is modernity, meaning this weird mashup and also regression. In other words, if bourgeois society transcended traditional Christianity, aka Catholicism, and brought about this secular humanistic version of Christianity, well then it could very well be that capitalism brings back the power of the old traditional Christian allegory, and maybe precisely in the form of allegory of modernity. Right, so it's just when people think that they are not being Christian that they are. Right, so again, L'Art Polar would appear to be the opposite of like Christianity. I should also say that Protestantism, sorry for this all being so terribly important, but it is. So what is the Protestant critique of Catholicism? Idolatry. Idolatry. So what does that do to images? Right? What does that do to art? What does it do to the acceptability of art, especially as imagistic and, you know, and about things? Right? Idolatry. I think I told you the comeback from the Catholics to the Protestants is, well, you're bibliophiles. Meaning you accuse us of worshiping images, you worship the book. and the ban on graven images that Protestantism has in common with Judaism and Islam. I told you about my husband who's Muslim. So in the time that we were dating, were we dating or were we married already? Noah, the film Noah came out. Do you guys know this movie? It's by one of these filmmakers. Dude. Totally forgetting his name right now, sorry. But Noah, the film. And, you know, it's actually a sweet film. I think it's Russell Crowe. Is Russell Crowe Noah? Something, yeah. It's actually an interesting, it's like a weird, but interesting and kind of a sweet film in some ways. Anyway, banned in Fazel's home country of Malaysia. Banned. Why? Because it depicts one of the prophets. You can't do that. You can't depict Noah. No. Not allowed. Okay.
Did you see it?
Oh yeah, we saw it. I know he was. I mean, at a certain level, he doesn't care. At another level, of course, he does care. Meaning, like, he has a requisite amount of skepticism about the depiction of the prophets, and he agrees that it's problematical to depict the prophets, but he also thinks you do, except not Muhammad, of course, right? So Isa, Jesus, Noah, yes, but Muhammad, oh no, right? Can't depict Muhammad. So Muhammad's a special prophet. But generally there's a ban on depicting prophets. So the ban on graven images in Protestantism, Judaism, and Islam, as opposed to Catholicism, which is rich in imagery.
I saw one painting of Egon Schiele, the cardinal and the nun in Vienna. Was it like in context to this, like?
So let's what did you say, the cardinal and the nun? Oh, it's the Leopold Museum. Oh, no, well, check it out. What is Austria? Catholic. Why is Austria not part of Germany? Because it's Catholic. They already have too many Catholics. No, it's serious, because Bismarck did the Culture Kampf. That's where we get the word culture war from, like the term culture war. It's the Culture Kampf. And that was Bismarck's attempt to suppress the Catholics in Bavaria, in Germany. So there was a question of why not have German unification that included Austria. No, it would be too many Catholics. Lena, what did you have in mind?
No, when you were talking about that, I just popped out in my mind, like.
This is very Jesus-y type bodies. You know, this is very passion bodies. Like these are bodies that are, I guess they're like contorted in like erotic bliss, but no, they're contorted in like Stations of the Cross passion, right?
It's like around the same time, right?
Well, this would be your high modernism, I guess. I guess you'd call this high modernism, kind of, right? What year is this? 1912, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely, like, Freud. You know, this is Freud's Vienna. Freud's Vienna. Oh. Anyway, so, but it is the question of allegory. So let's come back to it. And, yeah, sex is like crucifixion. Children. Definitely. That which is touched by the allegorical intention is torn from the context of life's interconnections. It is simultaneously shattered and conserved. Allegory attaches itself to the rubble. It offers the image of a transfixed unrest. The destructive impulse of Baudelaire is nowhere interested in the abolition of that which falls to him. Okay, so let's talk about this. So again, allegory is trying to bring together what has been broken up. And it is transfixed unrest, keep this phrase, in mind with Breton's Mad Love, which he calls it the fixed explosive. So it's that Breton says that he's most fascinated by images that seem to arrest action. So he's got the train that has been derailed, the locomotive that's been derailed and has been overgrown in the forest. And that's like his perfect image of the surrealist image. So the image of transfixed unrest, meaning allegory is trying to freeze things that have come apart. Okay, so traditional allegory versus modern allegory. Complicated. So traditional allegory is about the continuity of everything. In other words, everything is seamlessly part of God's creation, and everything is participating in everything else, and it's almost fractal in its character, meaning the microcosmic is allegorical for the macrocosmic, and literally everything that happens, everything that exists, and everything that it goes through is allegorical. In capitalism, specifically, that is broken up. And yet, there is an attempt to make an allegory out of that. Okay, so what is that about? And this is why Christian allegory is this funny thing. So there's ancient allegory, and then there's Christian allegory. So ancient allegory, the will of the gods. So everything that exists, everything that how it appears is the will of the gods. And yet, it's also evidence of the conflict between the gods. All right, so everything that exists is a manifestation of the conflict of the gods. So everything that conflicts in reality is an allegory for the gods' conflicts. So what happens to that when we are in monotheism? When the world is not composed of the conflicting principles of the different gods, but it's all one will of one God. And that means that the conflicts are internal to the will of one God rather than the clashing wills of different gods. All right, so that's like one change of the allegorical character. Then capitalism seems to break that up. So let's go from the allegory of everything that happens being internal to the will of one God to the bourgeois, humanistic universalism, which is that there's a coherence to human history. Again, everything happening for a reason. So if everything's not happening for the reason of God's intention, then everything is happening for a reason in terms of natural history. I think that we've encountered this category before, the types of history, natural history. That our own will participates in and is the expression of. But that has been smashed in capitalism. And so it's the way Benjamin interprets the function of the allegorical in Baudelaire. And not only in Baudelaire, but in modern art and literature more generally. So we looked at that Egon Schiele, like the cardinal and nun. Portrait, easel painting, portrait, right? A bourgeois genre of painting, is descended from Christian iconography, icons of the saints. And how were saints depicted in iconography? They were depicted as allegorical. In other words, the painting of the saint was supposed to be like the presentation of what made the saint a saint. So what it was that the saint suffered through and how that suffering was tied to the saint's beatification. Right, the saintliness of the saint is in the physiognomy of the saint, if we keep that in mind, but also in like everything that happened to the saint that was sort of visually depicted. Like the point of the portraiture was to sort of capture that. Now, bourgeois portraiture, it does the same thing. It does the same thing. It does exactly the same thing, except everybody's a saint now. Meaning that it's not an allegory of God's will, it's an allegory of the person's life. And how you can read the person's life into their physiognomy and into their trappings, their accoutrement, and in their kind of habitus, like their kind of circumstance, their context. But it's precisely that is coming apart in Baudelairean modernity. And yet, we only have these genres. We only have these bourgeois genres to work with. We have lyric poetry, we still have the easel painting tradition, we have still life, portraiture, and landscape. Everything is still that, even when it's at the outermost limits of that. It still is that. Right? And so it's an attempt to make an allegory out of the destruction of allegory. It's an attempt to make an allegory out of the destruction of allegorical meaning. So it's the meaning of the destruction of allegorical meaning. Again, if everything happens for a reason and that reason is God's will, or everything happens for a reason but it's our will, then what does it mean to live in an alienated society in capitalism where everything that happens seems to not be our will? Right? In which case it seems to be God's will again, but a kind of evil God. Because we seem to be denied redemption. We've talked about that category. Did we do redemption? Have we done redemption? I don't know if we've done redemption in this class. We might not have done redemption yet. We're getting there. I think we talked about it just briefly with Kafka. We did do the theological political fragment. Yeah, we did. Okay.
I have a question of
Yeah.
like generality of redemption in the discussion actually.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I was thinking of like, can you?
Oops.
Last one.
Right. Okay, so the concept of progress is to be grounded in the idea of catastrophe, that things just go on, is the catastrophe. If progress itself is already catastrophic, if the ongoing is the disaster, can there still be a moment of redemption at all? Good question. So, right. So redemption only happens through interruption, collapse, failure, not through continuity. And how is this generalizable? Okay, so I think that when we did the theological political fragment, we talked about redemption outside of time versus redemption within time. Meaning, it would seem like the very concept of redemption requires that it take place outside of time. And there seems to be a kind of inherent paradox in the idea of trying to redeem in time. Meaning, how is history redemptive? And the phrase from the theological political fragment is that nature is messianic by virtue of its eternal and total passing away. And then to strive after such passing is the task of world politics, whose method must be called nihilism. So that's the tricky part, meaning what would it mean to take up that process intentionally and to take up nihilism as redemptive? Right, because it would appear that nihilism is the opposite of redemption. It would appear that nihilism is the absence of the possibility of redemption. And yet, no, redemption is realized through nihilism.
In Krauss, that's what he talks about, basically. Yeah, there's
That's right, the destructive character,
Yep.
and also in the experience in poverty piece, the will to the tabula rasa, right? That this is the only redemption available to us. And that redemption, we also had redemption in Josephine the Singer. Kafka's Josephine the Singer, that Josephine will be redeemed like all of her brothers by being forgotten. Right, so we definitely tend to think of redemption as remembrance. But what would it mean to say that no, redemption is forgetting? Now, of course, Benjamin's not just coming up with these ideas, right? Rather, where are these ideas coming from? Well, they're coming from phenomenal symptoms. In other words, it is coming through Baudelaire. Now, the Baudelaire, to get back to the allegorical question, like as a function of time, reality is allegorical because it sort of forms a closed circle. So we may not, at any given moment, we may not see the closure of the full circle, but it is. Whereas he's saying rather that that's what's denied us now. In other words, the closed shape of reality, including temporal reality, is what's denied us. Remember always in the background, history. I mean history. History. So how is history figuring? So the microcosm and the macrocosm. So any course of events in creation is an allegory of all of creation. There's that idea. So the fact that the world moves through cycles is about each cycle being an allegory, we might say, for the total cycle of creation, namely the beginning and the end of the world, and therefore redemption. Okay, so allegory is about meaning in the temporal course of events, traditionally. Now, with Baudelaire, what we have instead is the attempt to make an allegory out of the experience of like the break in the continuity of events. And because Baudelaire is trying to make art out of it, inherently, he's trying to redeem it. To make art out of something is to attempt to redeem it. And so the question is, how is that happening? How is Baudelaire attempting to redeem this experiential reality, but also seemingly objective reality, like the actual world? There's a we'll take a break, but there's a something that we're going to read later that I feel the need to turn to it now. Okay, ready for some Baudelaire? This is from a later week, but let's do it now. The world is drawing to an end. Only for one reason can it last longer, just because it happens to exist. Suppose it should continue materially. Would that be an existence worthy of its name in the historical dictionary? I do not say that the world will be reduced to expedience in the buffoonish disorder of the republics of South America, that perhaps even we shall return to a savage state, and that we will go through the grassy ruins of our civilization to seek our grazing ground, rifle in hand. No, because such adventures would still suppose a certain vital energy, echo of first ages. No, rather, we shall furnish a new example of the inexorability of the spiritual and moral laws, and shall be their victims. We shall perish by the very thing by which we fancy that we live. Technocracy will Americanize us. Progress will starve our spirituality so far that nothing of the bloodthirsty, sacrilegious, or unnatural dreams of the utopists will be comparable to such positive results. Universal ruin will manifest itself not solely or particularly in political institutions or general progress or whatever else might be a proper name for it. It will be seen above all in the baseness of hearts. So this is towards the end of his life, he's writing this. These are the writings, by the way, that are influential, most influential for Nietzsche. These late aphorisms. So nothing dramatic is going to happen. That is the catastrophe. Right? Because again, if something dramatic were to happen, that would suggest that we're still heroic. But no, maybe we're not. Now, this gets back to the prostitution point, by the way. So the utopian socialists who wanted to abolish the family, like Charles Fourier and Saint-Simon, so what was their plan for sexuality? Are you ready? We're going to deal with this in a couple of weeks, but I'll give you a foreshadowing of it now. So they wanted to basically make sexual life into like a perfect, seamless, like bodily satisfaction of pure equality between the sexes, and basically like all of society would be a factory, meaning a kind of seamless production process in which sex would be slotted right in with everything else. So you'd have your like sex hour, like every day, and this would be like the perfect satisfaction of all needs, including sexual needs. And that the result of this, they thought, was that actually the biological difference between the sexes would disappear and everyone would become hermaphrodites. That once this technique had been perfected, then everyone would be rendered hermaphroditic. What did Marx think of that? That's capitalism. That's capitalism. That is capitalism. It's doing it to us. It is. It's already doing it to us. Yeah. It is capitalism. And that's not freedom. Why? Because why does everyone have to be the same to be equal? They don't. But capitalism makes it seem so. It gives us a kind of negation of the present where it seems like it's our differences that are the cause for our problems. No. It's the way our differences play out in capitalism that's the problem, not the differences themselves. Right, so, sexual equality doesn't have to be brought about by men carrying babies or something. That's not necessary. People can be different. And yet, capitalism suggests that the only way we can have equality is to make everyone the same. No. That's a distorted view of freedom and of equality. It's a symptom of capitalism. So that's the bloodthirsty, right? He's like, the future is going to be way beyond like the wildest dreams of the utopists. Except it's going to be not nirvana, but a nightmare. True.
I can see the last man, the end of history kind of presaged there.
By Nietzsche, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, that socialism was just an expression of the last man principle for Nietzsche, and he's right about that. Right, because again, everything that we associate with socialism and communism is exactly what Marx criticized as an ideology of capitalism. Now let's take a break. Zoom. Kind of.
When you described Baudelaire as like, oh, he's all of these horrible things, but he's us, it made me think of that Guston painting, The Studio, where the Klansman is painting the self-portrait.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Of course.
I didn't have a further thought, but you know.
Well, I mean, look, the Marxist approach to capitalism is that we all participate in it. You know, again, it's the view of capitalism is that it's a from below phenomenon, meaning it's reconstituted through the practices of everyday life, and that's why it can't be like changed through policy by elites. Like you can't overcome capitalism through some, like, I don't know. I think I always like to say this. If I gave a TED talk at Davos and convinced all the billionaires that we should do communism, it still wouldn't be possible to achieve it that way. And the reason is that the obstacle to it would be the working class. The working class would resist it. Right, so the working class has to overcome capitalism, at least in this view. And that's not for sentimental reasons, it's for practical reasons. You know, so yeah, you can convince all the capitalists to become communists, that won't be enough. It's not the capitalists who are making society capitalist, in this view. You know, this contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production, that's like kind of a primordial contradiction. It's sort of emergent with the Industrial Revolution. And also, just to add one final point to it, the Industrial Revolution itself is understood by Marx to be the product of workers' class struggle. Meaning the workers, like, claiming the value of their labor is what motivates the Industrial Revolution for Marx. Yeah. So basically capitalism is the class struggle because it's the product of the class struggle. And it's basically the self-defeat of the worker's own struggle that issues in this alienation of capitalism. Right. So it's the worker's own struggle for their bourgeois right, for the value of their labor, that produces this contradiction between the social relations and the forces of production. Marx thought. Again, it seems a lot more straightforward to say, oh, well, the capitalists were just greedy and just trying to like make money without having to pay workers, and that's why they instituted machines. Now, the way Marx describes it is that limiting the working day forced the introduction of technology into the production process, so that originally, like, workers in factories were it was like 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. And then there was a kind of popular and Christian backlash against this, right? That it's unchristian to exploit people this way, and you have to at least give them Sunday off and this kind of thing. And yet there was still a need to produce the same amount, and so that's what facilitated the introduction of machines. So it's with the limiting of the working day that is cause of the Industrial Revolution. And that, of course, if the struggle for the limiting of the working day was only things that like Protestant pastors were upset about, that wouldn't have been enough, right? So the working class had to assert its own.
Technology also had to be in a certain place by then to meet the demand of the shortening of the working day.
Kind of. Meaning, Marx likes to point out that they had the steam engine in ancient Rome. They already had the steam engine. But what did they use the steam engine for in ancient Rome? They used it to raise and lower the platforms in the arena, right? So they used it for ceremonial purposes and for blood sports basically. But it never occurred to anyone to use it to replace human labor, because of course they had slave labor, so they didn't so they had this technology, but it wasn't used the way we use it now, and that's a function of the social relations. Meaning maximizing productive activity as a function of time in society was not a priority for the Romans, because they could just conquer more slaves and deal with any productive needs that way. Right. It's only when you have the Protestant work ethic with its ideal of efficiency. Right, so the idea is the kind of Benjamin Franklin kind of Poor Richard's Almanac of penny saved is a penny earned, and early to bed and early to rise, and like basically the demand that like efficiency in time is like the height of like goodness, basically. Yeah. So. Anyway, yeah, we could say that maximizing productivity in time had a perverse effect of replacing human labor with machines. Because obviously machines are more temporally efficient than human beings are. Anyway, that's a complicated story. But anyway, that's Marx. Here we're dealing with more aesthetic phenomena. All right, so where should we pick up our?
This is last week.
This is last week. Okay, so this week. Okay. Yeah, you're right. I keep on switching back and forth.
I had a question around what Benjamin's doing to Baudelaire. Like, I thought it was like, in terms of describing him as almost as a commodity, the way that Baudelaire is like this poet who is like taking in information and then synthesizing it, but also concerned with the publication and the distribution of his writing. And I was curious, like, is Benjamin like similar to this kaleidoscope metaphor?
Mm-hmm.
Is like Benjamin making Baudelaire into like his own kaleidoscope, or this other idea of the artist is responsible for the distribution of their work, the poet is responsible for their words to be published.
Yes, let's talk about that. Okay, so to be an artist or to be a writer is to be like a bourgeois artisan. I think that we talked about this maybe, about one way that we think about this contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production is between production and consumption. That things are consumed in an industrial way, even though they're still produced in an artisanal way, in the realm of art in particular. So in the realm of art and literature, things are not produced factory style, but they are consumed factory style. Right, so in attempting to continue to be a bourgeois artist, what happens is that Baudelaire allows the conditions of consumption to affect the conditions of production, so that he is no longer like the creator in this kind of bourgeois humanistic sense of the artist as creator, or even the bourgeois notion of labor as creator, but rather the creation, and this is where the kaleidoscope metaphor comes in. What art is like, the artist is like the machine that's processing like experience. Like rather than the originator, he's just the sort of device through which the images are being processed and the language is being processed. Now you can imagine this is one of the reasons why Benjamin was so liked by postmodernists, because with like the semiotic view and like, the Roland Barthes, like the idea that like, the writer isn't the originator, that he's just sort of this pastiche machine of language, right? He's not an author, he's a writer, right? Poor Barthes. I mean, he's fine. But no, that's not exactly what Benjamin was doing. No, there's something a little tragic. I mean, I actually like Barthes' work, but I think the self-understanding is not up to snuff, not up to Benjamin's level. So, again, in trying to adapt lyric poetry to capitalism, what would that mean? It means that the poetry is embodying this contradiction between the writer as artisan and the writer as like just sort of operator within this almost machinic process.
I guess you might have just answered this, but is it that like the self-awareness of the contradiction that would like distinguish something like this from like genius in like the Greek sense, where it's like, oh, there are these divine forces and they're living in the artist's walls and
Right.
suggest like
Right.
you should paint that or whatever.
Well, here's the paradox. Okay, so in the ancient world, the artist is also not the originator, right? He's just a channel,
Yeah.
right? And also in the medieval, like Christian world, the artist is not the originator, but is just a sort of channel of like God's will or something. So it's when the artist's labor becomes like a thing, where it's like the artist's unique contribution. Because it's not that they're the total originator. Because the bourgeois notion of labor is not like that everything originates with the laborer. It's rather that the laborer is like the key kind of figure of transformation. So labor as transformative, as producing something that isn't already there. Meaning not just a vehicle for God's own activity, but sort of making their own contribution to that activity. So again, in capitalism, though, it appears like we revert back while still retaining this notion of the crucial contribution of the artist. So then the question is, well, what is the artist actually contributing then? What is the artist's own authorship? And does it come down to, well, his psychology? Because that's really what a lot of the Central Park is about, that his psychology makes him the perfect instrument of like making, poetry in capitalism. So it's almost like an accident that he is like the perfectly attuned device, and that's his authorship, that's his originality. You see, it's a kind of a paradox, or it's a kind of a contradiction. Now, the self-consciousness question, perhaps no one is actually self-conscious of anything in this way, of like, pure self-consciousness of this contradiction. But rather, it's the way that he's self-conscious about it. That he wants his poetry to be useful, first of all, so use value. He also wants it to be exchangeable, exchange value. He also wants it to be marketable. He wants it to find an audience. But he's frustrated. And he's frustrated on both scores, meaning he's frustrated about finding a market, and he's also frustrated about whether his writing is, in fact, useful in the way that he wanted it to be useful. He wanted it to be useful as a quality leisure time activity, as a quality entertainment. But again, he's deeply ambivalent about this. So for Benjamin, the reason, kind of tarrying on this a little bit, is that modernism remains romanticism. It does remain romanticism, meaning that there are kind of two souls of modernism. One is to continue romanticism, and the other is to completely transcend romanticism. And Baudelaire kind of exemplifies those two divergent tendencies. So his way of fighting against capitalism is to try to assimilate himself to it. And his way of assimilating himself to capitalism is fighting against it. Right, so this is important because, again, the idea that the class struggle is the engine of capitalism. That's also true for the individual artist. Meaning it's the struggle, the apparent struggle against capitalism that actually is capitalism. So it is, and it's on both sides. In other words, that again, in attempting to assimilate yourself to it, you're struggling against it. In struggling against it, you're assimilating yourself to it. I suddenly am reminded, since Freud came up, Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, her most famous, most widely read essay is called Identification with the Aggressor, where the idea is that you overcome trauma by imitating it. Right, so that's where Baudelaire is like the perfect kind of photographic exposure of modernity or something. Is like the perfect plate on which to register, because he is traumatized, and then his work is about imitating that trauma. And yet he's doing that in terms of bourgeois art, bourgeois literature. So he's still writing rhyme and verse, rhyme and meter verse poetry. So he's writing traditional poetic style. It's not free verse yet. And yet attempting to salvage that form while necessarily changing it. Right, so again, every great writer founds and dissolves a genre. So Baudelaire is simultaneously attempting to preserve, but he's also founding in a new way, and he's dissolving lyric poetry. He's doing all three things. And again, the question is, how is he doing it? So the particular qualities of both the subject and the subject matter and the form, the content and the form. You know, the kaleidoscope thing, okay, let's talk about the kaleidoscope, because Kant is always in the background. Kant thought of the imagination as the free play of the faculties. So the work of the imagination, the work of aesthetic judgment, is what he called the free play of the faculties. And so art is supposed to be that. And Schiller, who followed up on Kant in the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, said that art is the highest expression of the play drive. And the play drive is this synthesis of the sense drive and the form drive. And it is the most human kind of drive. And it is the expression of our freedom. So again, he kind of reiterated Kant, but using some new language, sense drive, form drive, and play drive. So here's the thing. So on the one hand, the ideal of the poet would be the child with the kaleidoscope. That would be the ideal. And yet it's a peculiar kind of image at the same time, which is that the poem as the kaleidoscope, like the poem as the piece of technology, and what is it doing? And again, I mentioned that the postmodernists love Benjamin because it's like, oh, everything's a remix. You know, the kaleidoscope is like the remix, and there's nothing original. Everything's just a remix. And it's like, well, you could say that about maybe art always, and yet there still is. What about the role of the child? Right. So, what is the role of the subject? In fact. So there's an attempt to preserve the bourgeois ideal of art as the free play of the faculties, namely the free play of the faculties, but under conditions that seem to mitigate against that. Meaning that it seems like the subject is precisely what's missing. So the artwork can seem to do this, but then the question is, what is the reader doing? You know, what is the listener doing? What is the viewer doing? So there's a kind of reversal, and it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, which is to understand art as technology means that our own activity seems to be taken up by the object. It's not the activity of the subject, it seems to be the activity of the object, and the activity object as if it were an automated machine. Right, so the artwork now appears to be an automated machine in a way that would not have made sense to the Renaissance humanists, for example. Like even with their technologized version of art, like if we think about, you know, Michelangelo and Da Vinci, you know, and science and art, that mashup, it still doesn't seem like the artwork is meant to be an automated machine that's just carrying along the viewer as if on a conveyor belt. No, that's like something specific to the 19th century. And that's where the shock effect, right? And the fact that the kaleidoscope seems to be about like the kind of crystallization, you know, that there's a kind of like, you're kind of shaking it up and then crystallizing. It's like this sort of crystallization of shock. And this is again the Marx language of, by the way, next week, pay attention to this with Breton, the crystal. crystal. Not Marianne Williamson, crystal, but the crystal. The artwork as crystal. Right, so because Marx described the commodity as the crystallization of value. And the crystallization of the value of labor. Also used the term congealed labor. But congealed seems more organic, crystal seems more inorganic and even technological, even though it's natural.
Just curious if, like, in terms of the poet and the writing and how those are seen as two different things, if Benjamin is suggesting that Baudelaire is like a poet that is showing that the poetry and the person are together, and by like laying out the instructions of how he's going on strolls and using all this regression and trauma to like make a poem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, like, how much is Benjamin like objectifying Baudelaire, like turning him into an automated machine of poetry?
The idea is that Baudelaire was doing that to himself. So we're going to see with the Surrealists next time, but also with Romanticism, like Hegel's notion of Romanticism, was that, again, in a very different way from the bourgeois humanistic notion of art, of like the artist as like artisan and as creator, but even if they are participating in a larger creation, they're still putting their contribution into it. That with Romanticism, there's this idea that you can't really make art the same way, you can't participate in creation that way, and so the artwork becomes a sort of a sign of the impossibility of the artwork. It becomes like the kind of like registration of like of the impossibility of doing that. Now, what that meant was, in fact, it flipped over into a question of what he talked about earlier, sensibility. Meaning what made the artist or the writer an artist in Romanticism was not what they actually made, but was their own sensibility. So it's almost as if the artist is substituting for the artwork. So basically the idea is to live your life as if it were a work of art or as if it were the experience of art. So it's a kind of collapsing. And in the same way that he talks about Baudelaire being his own impresario, that it's kind of like, another way of putting it is the artwork becomes an advertisement for itself. And the artist becomes a kind of image of himself. Meaning the artist lives as if they're a work of art and as if like their own sensibility is itself an aesthetic object. The Surrealists are going to go down that same path in the 20th century. And indeed, all the avant-garde movements have this essential moment where it's kind of like maybe the work is secondary and it's the attempt to like live your life according to an aesthetic sensibility, that's what art is. Right, so Baudelaire is both doing that and resisting it at the same time. Right, so he is trying not to do that, and yet he also is doing it. Right, so what you then get is this kind of split thing, where it's kind of all in the subject and all in the object. So it seems like Romanticism, it seems like the experience of art is something that is totally interior, but then Baudelaire really doesn't want to resolve it that way, so then it appears to be totally exterior, like it's in the objects, it's in the phenomena. And so it's that sort of, again, splitting of subject and object that gives a kind of reified subject and a kind of reified object, or a thing-like object. And that becomes the experience of one's alienation from reality, and also the experience of the object as alienated from reality. Now, how that recapitulates lyric poetry, I mentioned earlier, lyric poetry is supposed to be about raising the phenomenon out of the flow of time and sort of crystallizing it into an image and sort of eternalizing the moment. Like what is ordinarily, experientially a passing moment in the lyric poem is sort of frozen and turned into this thing that can survive the passage of time. He is doing that, again, But the question is, how is he doing it? And in the way that he's doing it, isn't he expressing the impossibility of doing that? Right, so this is the beginning of modernism because it's kind of like, well, where is the poetry? Is the poetry in the writer? Is the poetry in the reader? Or is the poetry in the poem itself? Divorced from all human experience, but somehow deposited in the object. Which again, would not have made sense to people before this time. In other words, you have some auguring of it with Romanticism, but before this time, people wouldn't think of it that way. They would think of the religious example of art. That they would think of art as a way of communing with God. And then the poet is like an intermediary, he's a kind of a shamanistic or priestly type figure or magician type figure who is basically allowing that communion between God and people to take place through the work of art. But it wouldn't be hived off this way. It wouldn't be in this kind of like inaccessible place either in the work or in the subject, or incommunicable place. Yeah. The task of the translator piece, again, what it means for Benjamin to say no poem is written for the reader, no piece of music for the listener, and no painting for the viewer. It's not supposed to be this occultation. It's not supposed to be pure esotericism. Neither is it with Baudelaire. Baudelaire also doesn't want to be, do occultation or esotericism. He wants it to be legible. He wants it to be, experienceable. And yet, it also seems like it tends in that direction. It tends to this occultation or esoteric place. In between Baudelaire and the Surrealists, there is like the embrace of occult and esoteric by in the high modernist era. And then the Surrealists both continue that, but also chafe against it, kind of try to bring art back into the realm of experiential reality. Right. So, but again, what we have to keep in mind what all this struggle is about. In other words, why is it this extremely difficult and agonized struggle for Baudelaire? It's not just the peculiarity of his psychology. It seems like it might be. Again, when we think about what Freud said about melancholics, that it's the way they're invested in the object that's the problem. And so it's kind of like, okay, it's on the psychology of the person, but what about the fact that all of us have an aspect of our psychology that is this, and that modernity seems to be about playing up this aspect of things, this aspect of experience. To put it in the terms of the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Benjamin, Baudelaire is the replacement of the magician by a technician. Right, so he does think that this is actually what's happening, as opposed to, the kind of socialist realist idea would be that Baudelaire is shirking his responsibility as a responsible artistic worker, right? And Benjamin's like, no, he's doing his duty perfectly, right? And he's not doing what other contemporaries or kind of predecessors and also those who come after him, which is to try to turn art into a kind of aristocratic kind of domain. Right, so both the later modernism and high modernism, but also Romanticism has this kind of aristocratic thing that they do with art that breaks with the humanist ethos. That in order to preserve the meaning of art, you have to withdraw it into a kind of esoteric realm, of kind of an aristocratic status. Baudelaire's not doing that. He's not doing that. That's important. Because there are others who do that. He's not. Oh, Phantasmagoria. Did we have Phantasmagoria? I thought we had this language. Did we, or did we not yet? I thought that we did.
So under socialism, would art revert back to the occult?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Because that would just be the adverse side of religion. Right? So, it would probably be a different relation between the cult value and the exhibition value. Meaning it wouldn't be the separation of those two things the way we do now, where the exhibition value is dubious because it's unclear who the audience for art is, but also it wouldn't just be dissolved back into culture. It would be just like a social ritual value by that. I thought that we had this language.
It's 35. I
Yeah, I was trying to do a text search, but I guess there's no text search. This is not a text searchable document. Yes, okay, we're going to encounter a similar. Here we go, okay. Eternal recurrence is an attempt to link the two antinomic principles of happiness with one another, namely that of eternity with that of yet once again. The idea of eternal recurrence conjures out the misère, or wretchedness, of the time, the speculative idea or phantasmagoria of happiness. Nietzsche's heroism is the counterpart of Baudelaire's, which out of the wretchedness of Philistine routine conjures up the phantasmagoria of the modern. Okay, here's our term. All right, so let's. Let's situate this. Okay, we'll end on this note. So this is from the Fetishism of Commodities in chapter 1 of volume 1 of Das Kapital, section 4 of the chapter 1. So we did not do this before. Okay, all right, good. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason why the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. In the same way, the light from an object is perceived by us not as the subjective excitation of our optic nerve, but as the objective form of something outside the eye itself. But in the act of seeing, there is at all events an actual passage of light from one thing to another, from the external object to the eye. There is a physical relation between physical things. But it is different with commodities. There, the existence of the things as commodities and the value relation between the products of labor which stamps them as commodities have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. There, it is a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the phantasmagorical form, it's a bad translation, phantasmagorical form of a relation between things. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labor so soon as they are produced as commodities, and which is therefore inseparable from the production of commodities. The fetishism of commodities has its origin, as the foregoing analysis has already shown, in the peculiar social character of the labor that produces them. Okay, so phantasmagorical form. We did not look at the letter from Adorno to Benjamin criticizing. No, okay, we'll get there. So phantasmagoria. So what is a phantasmagoria? That is the carnival entertainment attraction from the industrial era. And it's an English word that Marx used in the German writing of Das Kapital, which then they took out of the English translation, which is like really bizarre. No, because fantastic form makes it seem like it's a fantasy. Phantasmagoria is a very specific thing. It's what we get the term smoke and mirrors from. So it is basically like they produce smoke and then they project light into the smoke, and they use like objects to project shadows, and then they have backlit silhouette objects. And so you have the interaction of objects in silhouette and projected shadows of objects. And the point of it is that you can't tell whether you're seeing a real thing or the projected shadow of the thing. And it's like optical illusion and play, right? Yeah, so that's the world we're living in capitalism. We can't be sure whether we're dealing with objects or the shadows of objects, whether we're seeing cause or effect, reversal of cause and effect. That is also, by the way, a Lukács idea of reification, is that the phenomena of reification mean that we treat things that are the effects as if they're the cause. So I mentioned about technology. We treat technology as the cause rather than as the effect. So that's true of everything in capitalism, is that we reverse means and ends, we reverse cause and effect, we reverse shadow and object. Right. So that our actual reality is this kind of ambiguous realm of shadows. Now, there's a letter by Benjamin we'll read later. Let's just look up the quotation. Letter by Adorno to Benjamin, we'll see, criticizing, something that we're going to read later. Here's slow. Okay, here we go. I'll post this to the announcements on Canvas. So this is how Adorno put it. The fetish character of commodities is not a fact of consciousness. Rather, it is dialectical in the eminent sense that it produces consciousness. Perfection of the commodity character in Hegelian self-consciousness inaugurates the explosion of its phantasmagoria. Meaning, how do we know that we're living in a phantasmagoria? Because it's exploding. How do we know that we're living in commodity fetishism? Because commodity fetishism is exploding. Meaning, in bourgeois society before the Industrial Revolution, it would not have made sense to say that they lived in commodity fetishism. I guess they did. But it was their seamless reality. So fetish here is not the psychological fetish. It's not the psychoanalytic fetish. It's not a substitute object. It's not that, displaced gratification. Fetish is the anthropological fetish from ancient religion. So basically our fetishism is labor as value. That's what commodity fetishism is. So we believe in the magical, prodigious, divine, creative power of labor, human activity, blood, sweat, and tears, time, labor time. That is our self-evident reality in the way that the spirits and the gods were the self-evident reality of ancient peoples, as a practical and not only a theoretical matter of consciousness. So our consciousness is bourgeois consciousness produced by the fetishism of commodities, but when we achieve self-consciousness of it, so the Hegelian perfection of that would be Marxism, that is contemporaneous with the explosion of its phantasmagoria. Okay, so that's what that word means. And in the, oops. Oh no, this is the wrong one. Wait, I thought we were in section 33 already, sorry. There we go. Oh, I will say something about male impotence. Did you know that for Freud, the most common neurosis that men went to see him for was impotence? You have to read between the lines, but it's there, right? But it's almost like the thing that can't announce itself, right? So that's how so neurotic impotence or psychogenic impotence, and that was Baudelaire. So Baudelaire was again ahead of his time that way. Jugendstil, we will talk about this. The Jugendstil, wait, not 33? Where was the Phantasmagoria? 35? 35, okay, sorry. Eternal recurrence. Hell is not something which lies ahead of us, but this life here. We'll come back to some of these things. So Jugendstil, the example that I like to, Art Nouveau and Jugendstil are the same. Basically, it's two words, like we go French and German. So we're doing Central Park. Where is our Central Park bridge? This one. This is a perfect example of Art Nouveau or Jugendstil. Right, so this is a ironwork, but also like organic, like imitating the organic. Have you guys seen the, because Benjamin writes about him. Yes. Yeah, Bloesfeld, sorry. Yeah. So Bloesfeld, the photographer, right? So these are organic forms, but they're photographed in such a way as if they are like technological forms. The internet sucks. It's all the fault of Web 2.0. Everything's a fucking pop-up. Anyway, so yes, that is Jugendstil, that is Art Nouveau style, and the idea is that Baudelaire is ahead of that. And also, is this an image of heaven or hell? Right. In other words, the kind of metallization of organic life. It's kind of infernal, isn't it? Right. And I think we did talk about this. Oh no, that was my other class. About the thing about technology and capitalism is that technology imitates human action. And in fact, technology could be used to do other things, and yet we always make it imitate human action. Right? Or sometimes imitate the action of animals. But we don't allow technology to do what it could do, which is do something entirely different from what organic life forms do.
Because we construct it.
Because we construct it, but also because of the way we use it, what we want it to do, right? We want it to replace us, whereas it could do something else, and also that means that we could do something else rather than mechanize our own action. So like making technology imitate the human and making humans and imitate technology, getting beyond capitalism would break the compulsion to do that. All right. See you next week.
Thank you. Am I the only one to do next week? It doesn't